here we go. Welcome to the Florida Teacher Certification Exam Reading Workshop, Part 1. Today is October 29th. So the agenda for today, first of all, I'm going to give you an introduction of myself, tell you about who I am, and talk about the general knowledge test, what it is comprised of, and then specifically we're going to talk about the reading part. I have a little warm-up activity for you to do. I'm going to provide you the link so that you can do it on your own. And then we're going to talk about competency 1. And then we're going to talk about planning a course of study and suggested study methods. How do you prepare for this test? Okay, and you can always, I have some time planned in for a Q&A session, but you can always contact me. I'll put my email address up at the end of the video so that you can contact me if you'd like. Just a reminder that the second workshop will be on November 12th at the same time, and we will cover competencies 2 and 3, and also some test-taking strategies. So just an introduction of myself. My name is Dr. Brandy Gatlin-Nash. I am a former K-12 teacher. I actually taught elementary special education for 6 years. I taught students with varying exceptionalities at the elementary level. And then I taught at the high school for 1 year. I actually taught math. And also I continued to work with students who had exceptionalities at the high school level. I went back and got my PhD from Florida State University. So I am very connected to FAMU. My husband actually is a graduate of FAMU, so I consider myself an honorary Rattler. I am currently an assistant professor in the School of Education at University of California, Irvine. I teach classes in language and literacy and about students who have exceptionalities and disabilities. And my research focuses on non-mainstream dialects of English and how it impacts children when they're learning to read. I also do professional development with teachers about non-mainstream dialects of English so that they can recognize features of those dialects when they are listening to students read and when they're looking at their writing samples. So, about the Florida Teacher Certification Exam. So the general knowledge test is computer-based. It's an exam that's used to assess mastery of fundamental academic skills like math and reading. Passing this exam is one of the ways that you, aspiring teachers, can meet the general knowledge requirements for teacher certification in Florida's public schools. What subjects does the general knowledge test cover? Well, it has an essay. You have 50 minutes to complete that. You have an English language skills dealing with grammar, the mechanics of English, reading, which we're going to talk about today. And then it also has a mathematics subtest. So the reading test, what is that made of? So during this subtest, you must demonstrate your reading comprehension and critical thinking skills. The former, reading comprehension, entails understanding words in context and identifying the main idea of a passage, as well as factors influencing its style and tone. While the latter, critical thinking skills, this focuses more on your ability to assess differing points of view and analyze an argument. It's exactly what it says. You're thinking critically. You're not just taking the information that's there in the text. You're using what you already know and using different perspectives and points of view to analyze an argument. This section will have several short passages, which will be accompanied by a few multiple choice questions each. And it's about 40 questions total, and the passing score is 200 points. So we're going to I'm going to send you a link for a practice passage at the end of this. So you'll see that they're going to probably be about 5 questions each. And of course, that's an approximation. Not all of them will be exactly 5 questions each, but you can kind of estimate that there will be about 7 or 8 passages, and there'll be about 5 or 6 questions each. So getting ready for the test. There's something that a lot of us, I don't want to use the word suffer, but a lot of us have an issue with. We know that you are intelligent, you're talented. You wouldn't have gotten into the illustrious Florida A&M University if you were not of a certain caliber. But when it comes to taking a test, there's something that happens when you sit down and you know that this test is important. Something happens with your body. You may start sweating, your stomach may start rumbling, your thoughts may start to race. Sometimes we have what's called test anxiety. It's a real thing. So, what I'm here to do is to try to calm some of that test anxiety. And this diagram actually shows you that too little stress, that's not necessarily a good thing. You're not worried about it. You're too laid back. Oh, it's not a big deal. You're not going to do that great. And so you think about this X and Y axis. So at the across, which is your X axis, you have your anxiety level. And then your Y axis, the up and down, is student performance. So the optimal stress level, you're going to do very well on the test. You know that this test is important, but it's not to the point where you are stressed out and sweating about it. Once you get to the point that fatigue and exhaustion overload takes over, your performance starts to dwindle down. And then when you get to the point of burnout, anxiety, panic, even a meltdown, that's when you're not going to do very well on the test. So the idea is to stay in the optimal stress level and do the best that we know that you are capable of doing. Okay. So I wanted to talk about test anxiety, but then also a lot of times when we have a multiple choice test, we have anxiety about, okay, if I pick the wrong one, then I'm leaving out this one. What if I'm picking the wrong one? You may actually overthink things sometimes. And sometimes multiple choice exams can induce anxiety. A lot of times we think, oh, it's multiple choice. That means I can just pick one of the answers. But some people have issues with multiple choice because you have to pick one. You're forced to pick one of the answers. So I have a warm-up activity that I wanted to do with you all. So you're just going to have to watch my screen as I pick the answers. But I want you to become more and more comfortable with taking multiple choice exams or picking out the best answer. So I'm going to follow this link, but I will give you access to the link as well. Or actually, I'm not going to click on that link, but this will be the link that you will click on later. All right, so this is just a warm-up activity to get me or whoever is watching this just used to doing some multiple choice questions. If something is stated explicitly, its meaning is an approximation, clear and obvious, obscure, or incorrect. I think it's clear and obvious. All right. What is the theme of the tortoise and the hare? Slow and steady wins the race. Even little friends can be a big help. Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Or a stitch in time saves 9. I think it's slow and steady wins the race. Oh, I'm winning. Which of these would be considered a type of technical text? Algebra for Dummies, a Mustang repair manual, a physics textbook, or all of the answers are correct. But it looks like all of these are technical. They're telling me how to do something. So I'm going to choose all of the answers are correct. Which of these is not a form of print media? A tour brochure, a radio news program, a fictional novel, or an academic journal. So that keyword is not a form of print media. I might not know exactly what print media is, but I'm going to guess radio news program because that's not print. What term is used for the words, phrases, and statements that support, define, or explain the main idea? Theme, central idea, supporting details, or characters? There's a key word up in the question. Supports, defines, or explains the main idea. So I'm going to think supporting details. Oh wow, how surprising is that? I won. Thank you. All right. So there might have been something else that you noticed in that quiz that also would give some people anxiety. And I'll give you a minute to think about that. Shouldn't take you long. Did anyone notice that timer on the left-hand side? As that timer was going, that often is something that adds stress as well. So the test that you will be taking, the Florida Teacher Certification Exam test, will be timed. But I also want us to start thinking about how we can stay within the time limit and how we can remember that there is a time limit without letting the time limit distract us from the actual test. Okay, so the competencies, there are a total of 3 competencies for the reading test, but the one I want to talk about today is competency 1, knowledge of key ideas and details based on text selections. And this deals with the idea of what is explicitly and implicitly in the text that you're reading, the key ideas and the details. So using context, would you be able to answer this question? We had a woossis. What is a woossis? Is it a tropical fish, an egg beater, or a leather suitcase? There's not enough information, right? We can look at woossis and we could probably say, okay, what word part is it, or what part of speech is that? It's probably a noun, right? We had a woossis, but we can't really figure out what else. It's a made up word. But what if I added, we had a woossis, but the handle broke? Okay. So more than likely, that's not a tropical fish, but it could be an egg beater because an egg beater has a handle, but it could also be a leather suitcase. There's still not enough information, right? What if we added, we had a woossis, but the handle broke, so we had to beat the eggs with the fork. Now there's enough information for you to make an educated guess that a woossis is an egg beater because you wouldn't beat eggs with a leather suitcase, and we've already ruled out a tropical fish, so we know that it's an egg beater. So when you're using context, the answer is always there. It's just a matter of figuring out the pieces to show you what the answer is and ruling out the answers when you're taking multiple choice exams. So when the answer is there, we call it being explicit. And I'm going to show you a short video that deals with explicit meaning and when things are explicitly stated in the text.
Have you ever had anyone tell you to read between the lines? It is an idiom, an expression meant to encourage you to think critically and figure out what's going on when things are not obvious. When something is obvious or stated directly in a text, it's called being explicit. In this lesson, we will discuss what it means to state something explicitly and how to do it, as well as examine a few practice sentences that will illustrate what being explicit means. When something is stated explicitly, this means the exact meaning of something is clearly stated. The meaning should be clear and obvious to anyone reading the statement. Stating things explicitly is often important in professional settings, such as in the workplace, a hospital, or in the classroom. For example, if at the end of a meeting, your boss says, "Someone take care of this," she's not being very explicit. Depending on the nature of the meeting, you may not be sure exactly what she means. However, if your boss states her wishes explicitly, saying, "Make sure your team finishes the report and has it to me by close of business," then you know exactly what she wants. Stating things explicitly can help clear up confusion. The opposite of this, of course, is when something is stated implicitly, meaning the actual explicit meaning isn't directly stated, it's implied. To help us illustrate just what we mean, let's look at a real-life example. Well, sort of a real-life example, a movie. Do you remember the last time you've been to a movie that included romance? There's a good chance that during that movie, there was a scene where the two actors went out on a date, perhaps to dinner at a nice restaurant, followed by a walk or another activity. The movie showed them having a good time, laughing, enjoying themselves, and even sharing a few kisses. After the date scene, the movie cuts to the two lovers waking up in bed together the next morning. In this movie, whatever amorous activity happened in between that time period is implied. If that activity had been shown explicitly in the movie, well, it would have been a completely different type of movie altogether. Things get stated both explicitly and implicitly in texts all the time. When the meaning is obvious and stated clearly, it is explicit. If you're not exactly sure what the text is saying, or you have to think a bit about it before realizing what it means, it's probably not very explicit. Let's take a look at a few examples of explicit text done well. The patient has been having contractions every 30 minutes, with a pain intensity of 7. Or, at the end of the block, turn left onto Maple Street and walk 300 yards to the bus stop. Both of these are clear, explicit statements. The first sentence is stating patient information, including exact statistics, while the second is giving clear and concise directions. Both are good examples of explicit text. Now that we have a good handle on what is explicit and how it's conveyed, let's take a look at several sentences. In each, try to gauge if the meaning is explicit. 1. Spin around 10 times, drop the baseball bat, and run the last 10 meters to the finish line. 2. The patient is not doing very well. 3. When something like that occurs, we tend to run into major issues. 4. She was very happy to meet you, and she would like to see you again on Thursday. Or 5. The Lions won their game this past Sunday, meaning they will play in the Super Bowl in 10 days. Which of these questions does a good job of stating the information explicitly? Statements 1, 4, and 5 do a good job at being explicit. In all three, the information presented is clear, concise, and doesn't force the reader to ask extra questions or assume the meaning. Statements 2 and 3 are not very explicit. Statement 2 is an approximation and tells us very little about the patient's condition. Statement 3 does an equally poor job being explicit. It forces the reader to ask more questions. What kind of issues? If you tend to run into them, does it happen all the time? Most of the time, neither is very explicit. When something is stated explicitly, that means it's stated clearly and the meaning is obvious. Stating things explicitly can be very helpful in professional settings and others where exact information is needed. If something is stated implicitly or simply not stated well, it can leave a reader guessing at what the person is actually saying.
All right, so from that video, you should have gotten that explicit meaning is something that you get directly from the text. It's direct. It is, there aren't questions about it. You see it clearly in front of you. Implicit would be the opposite. So answer these questions. Which of the following is an explicit statement? A, we have had several difficulties over the course of the procedure. B, there are numerous errors which we will have to address later. C, the board has asked to meet your team at 11:30 in the large boardroom. Or D, we have been having fun all day long. Pick which one of these is an explicit statement. Let's go through them one at a time. We have had several difficulties over the course of the procedure. Okay, what is the difficulty? several, some people might think several is 3, some people might think several is 20. It's not giving you explicit, detailed information. So is that an explicit statement? No. B, there are numerous errors which we will have to address later. Okay, is that telling me something clearly? Do I have questions? Yes, I still have questions. Numerous. Could that be 12? Could that be 50? An error, okay, that's a mistake or something that's wrong, but is it something written down? Is it something that can be fixed? We'll have to address it later. Is that later today? Does that mean tomorrow, next week? There are still a lot of questions. It's not explicit. The board has asked to meet your team at 11:30 in the large boardroom. Okay, that seems pretty clear. They want to meet my team at a specific time, 11:30, at a specific place in the large boardroom. So I think the answer is C, but you never want to eliminate all of your answers until you go through them all. So D, we have been having fun all day long. Okay, my definition of fun is probably not your definition of fun. So what does fun even mean? Okay. And does all day long, does that mean that you've been up since midnight and you've been going and having fun since then? Or does that mean that you got up at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock? What is all day? So there are still questions about D. So the explicit statement would be C. The board has asked to meet your team at 11:30 in the large boardroom. Okay, you should be able to answer this. If something is stated explicitly, its meaning is clear and obvious, incorrect, an approximation, or obscure. Okay, from watching the video and even just knowing what the word explicitly means, you should be able to figure out A, clear and obvious. The opposite of explicit is correct, incorrect, implicit, or clear. Okay, process of elimination. We know that the opposite of explicit is not necessarily correct or incorrect. And explicit actually means clear, so we know that the answer is C. Where can stating things explicitly be helpful? The workplace, the hospital, classroom, or all of these are correct. From time to time, you will get questions like this, where you have to decide, they're basically asking me, is it one of these or is it all of these? So you have to go back and ask yourself, would it be helpful to state things explicitly in the workplace? Okay, yes, it would probably be helpful because if you give vague directions, then we don't know, or the people who work in the office or workplace don't know exactly what to do. At the hospital, yeah, definitely stating things explicitly is helpful. A doctor wouldn't say, give me a few cc's of this fluid so that I can get this patient back breathing or whatever. If you can tell, I don't work at a hospital. But it has to be explicitly stated. A specific number has to be given. Okay. In the classroom, is it helpful to state things explicitly? Definitely. You have to know when you're meeting, what the expectations are on the syllabus. You want to know exactly what your grade will be, your instructor, or at least not an ineffective instructor would just tell you, hey, yeah, just turn in that paper next week. They're going to give you a deadline and tell you when they expect it, how they expect it to be turned in, and they're going to give you details. So the best answer is D. All of these are correct. Which of the following is not an explicit statement? Again, you're going to have multiple choice questions that are going to make you go through, pick out 3 or 4 that are, and then one that is not. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on the one that is not. So A, the doctor had asked to schedule a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks from today. B, there are errors on pages 4, 7, and 14, which need to be fixed. C, go left at the light, then continue for 3 blocks until you see the red building. Or D, I'm going to follow up with someone about that later. 3 of these are explicit and 1 is not. Which one do you think? If you chose D, you are correct. I'm going to follow up with someone. We don't know who that someone is about that. We also don't know what that is. And later. And again, might that be later today, tomorrow, next week, at the end of the year? Later could be a lot of different things. Making inferences. So this is the opposite of explicit meanings. So there are different things that you probably do in your own life where you're making inferences and or drawing conclusions. The information is not explicitly stated, it's not clearly there, but using what you know, you can draw conclusions and make inferences. So think about, just for a few seconds, what are some ways that you make inferences in your everyday life? I have an example. I am working from home, like a lot of us right now. And there are times that I will come home and I live with my husband, and he goes into his office at times, or sometimes he works from home. But I might go to the grocery store during the day and come back, and I see a cup on the counter or a paper towel, something on the counter, shoes in the kitchen. I make an inference that, oh, my husband must be home because he has a habit of leaving his things around. So I don't know for sure that he's home. We live in an apartment, so I don't see his car necessarily. I haven't seen him yet, but I can make an inference that he's home. And I'm sure that you all make inferences all the time in your everyday life because you see evidence of something happened, even something happening or have happened, but you didn't see it happen for yourself. Just like if you were to come home, if you live alone, and if you were to come home and see that the door had been broken and your TV was missing, you could make an inference that someone had broken into the house and stolen the TV. And would it be safe to go into that apartment? No, because you can draw the conclusion that there could be someone still in your house. So making inferences is part of our everyday life, but it's something that you also do when you're reading passages. So just to give an example, I want you to read this passage and then answer this question. What can you infer about Michael from this passage? Okay. So after reading this passage, do you feel like Michael feels proud of his country? Yeah, he might feel proud of his country, but read all of your choices before you make your final answer. Michael is looking forward to the challenge of being in the military. Look at the words that are used. This seemed like madness. He was supposed to fight a war in a foreign land, helping to protect people he didn't even know. Michael had a strong sense of patriotism, but he was worried about the bombs, death, and carnage that could await him in Iraq. He pondered whether he would ever see his family again. Does this sound like he's looking forward to the challenge of being in the military? I don't think so. So going through, if we're eliminating, yeah, we could, if those were our only two choices, we could say, yeah, he feels proud of his country, because if you're not proud of your country, more than likely you're not going to go fight a war for your country in another land. But let's keep going to make sure that's the best choice. He is afraid of going into battle. Okay, those words that are being used sound like someone who is not looking forward to going to battle. He's actually scared. He pondered whether he would ever see his family again. If you are having that thought, then more than likely you are afraid, you are scared. So far, C is our best answer. Or the third one, he regrets joining the military. So looking at those last two, when you make an inference, you don't want to go too far. So, regretting joining the military, we could make that assumption, but from what we are reading, we will probably infer that he's afraid of going into the battle. We don't necessarily know that Michael is regretting joining the military, because joining the military definitely has a lot of benefits. So it's not like the paragraph is saying that Michael wishes he would have gone to community college instead of the military, or Michael is looking back and questioning the choices that he made. It doesn't sound like he regrets joining the military, period. It just sounds like he's afraid of going into this particular battle. So you make an inference that he's afraid of going into battle. With multiple choice, a lot of times, if there are four potential or possible answers, two of them you can eliminate quickly. One will be questionable, and then one will clearly be the correct answer. Okay. All right, so I have some practice for us, but what I'm going to do is go to the link myself, and then I'll just share my screen so that we can go through the test together. All right, so you may remember that when I was talking about the test, there's going to be a reading passage, and then there are going to be a short reading passage, and then there are going to be maybe about 5-6 questions that go with that particular reading passage. So we're going to go through this one together. So here are the exam instructions. Read the following passage carefully. Answer questions 1 through 5 based on the passage. All right, so one strategy that I'm going to talk about for the next workshop is test taking strategies. What I like to do when I have a passage in front of me and I have questions, I go to the questions first. So that way I know what I'm looking for. Even if I'm not necessarily just going to the question and then trying to find that particular answer for that one, it's still just giving me an idea of what I'm looking for. So my first question: identify the most accurate statement of the central idea of this passage. So central idea is basically the main idea. What's the most accurate statement that tells me what the main idea of the passage is? Number 2, all of the following pieces of information relate to the urban revolution, except, okay, so basically 3 of these are going to be correct, 1 is going to be incorrect. In this context, the word opulent most nearly means, okay, so this is a vocabulary word. So they're going to be basically telling me what that word means in context. So I have to pay attention to my context clues. The author's statement that the church began to sing a new tune and acknowledged that the necessary evils of merchants is, okay, so they're giving me a statement from the passage, and I have to interpret what that means. And number 5, in this context, the word insatiably most nearly means, so basically I have another vocabulary word and I have to use my context clues to figure out what that means. Okay, so when you have a passage in front of you, read carefully. Many times I have a habit of reading something, my mind starts to drift and think about something else, and I'm sure that happens to a lot of you. So just go back, read it again, make sure that you understand it. Okay. The urban revolution would have sweeping implications for European history. The clearest change was economic. Before the urban revolution, each lord's manor was designed for self-sufficiency. They made their own food, forged their own iron, and wove their own fabric. By trying to do everything, these feudal manors ended up doing everything rather poorly. So when I finish a passage, I kind of think to myself, what happened? Okay, they're basically talking about the fact that before there was this urban revolution, all these separate manors tried to do everything for themselves. But it made me think about that saying, jack of all trades, master of none. You can do a lot of things, but you don't do anything very well. So you're trying to do too much basically before the urban revolution. By contrast, so they're going to tell me something different, as the European economy expanded, cities began to specialize and carve out their respective niches on the international market. University towns like Paris and I'm guessing it's Bologna became centers of science and scholarship. London, Genoa, Venice, and Cologne became the long distance trade centers of their respective regions. And manufacturing cities like Milan, Ghent, and Bruges began laying the foundations for the large scale factories of the Industrial Revolution. All right, so in that one, I got a little tripped up on just trying to read those city names. So I'm going to go back and read that to make sure that I understand it. By contrast, as the European economy expanded, cities began to specialize and carve out their respective niches on the international market. University towns, or probably a place like Tallahassee, a university town like Paris, and I don't know the correct pronunciation of that. The way we say it, of course, is Bologna, but I don't know if that's how you, the correct pronunciation of the place, became centers of science and scholarship. London, Genoa, Venice, and Cologne became the long distance trade centers of their respective regions. And manufacturing cities like Milan, Ghent, and Bruges began laying the foundations for the large scale factories of the Industrial Revolution. All right, so they're basically telling us about these particular cities and towns that are specializing in these particular things. Um, okay, with specialization came sweeping advances as like minded scholars, merchants, and craftsmen worked together to explore new questions, open new markets, and develop new products and tools. Cities became the intellectual hearts of their regions. With all these great minds together, intellectual experimentation expanded at a rate not seen in Europe since classical Athens. So specialization is happening. People are getting better and better at what they are doing. With the growth of cities and revitalization of trade, a wealthy middle class of merchants and craftsmen began to emerge. Though these profit minded individuals at first received the scorn of both nobles and the clergy, they soon demonstrated the incredible potential of free enterprise. Some of these merchants became even richer than the aristocrats who scorned them. In certain Italian cities, it became almost impossible to distinguish a lord from a merchant, as both lived in town in opulent palaces. I remember seeing that word. So I'm just going to put a little highlight on it because that's something I know I'm going to end up coming back to. Okay. So it sounds like they're saying these cities are getting bigger, they're making more money, they're trading. You're starting to have these people who aren't lords, but they aren't servants. You're developing a middle class of merchants and craftsmen. And I wonder how the lords feel about that. So it became almost impossible to distinguish a lord from a merchant, as both lived in town in opulent palaces. So it sounds like opulent might mean something like luxurious or something that only people with a certain amount of money can afford, but we'll come back to that. These political shifts brought about new forms of government as cities experimented with ruling themselves. Even the church, which for so long had condemned the behavior of this middle class as detestable, shameful, and insatiably greedy, began to sing a new tune and acknowledge that the necessary evils of merchants and moneylenders were perhaps more necessary than evil. So it sounds like the church actually, for a long time, they didn't like this whole middle class and entrepreneur type behavior. But they saw that it was actually something that was necessary. They needed these merchants. They needed people who specialized in particular things instead of just having everyone in the Lord's banner do all of these different things that they weren't necessarily good at. All right, so let's look at these questions one at a time. Identify the most accurate statement of the central idea of the passage. What's the whole thing about? Okay. A, the urban revolution upset the church. They didn't really mention the church until the last paragraph, so I don't know about that one. B, the urban revolution upset the aristocrats. Didn't necessarily say that. We kind of inferred that, but it didn't really seem like the central idea of the whole passage. C, the urban revolution resulted in a more robust European economy. Or D, the urban revolution increased the income of the average worker. Okay, so I'm thinking that it's between C and D, but which one do you think it is? I'll give you a couple of minutes, even if you have to go back. Is it the urban revolution resulted in a more robust European economy, or the urban revolution increased the income of the average worker? We could guess that it's one of them, but there's one that is just a better answer. The paragraph or the passage doesn't necessarily talk about the average worker. It talks about people who start trades and then they become wealthy middle class. But it doesn't really talk about the average worker. And look at those very first few sentences. The urban revolution would have sweeping implications for European history. The clearest change was economic. So I think that the best answer is C. The urban revolution resulted in a more robust European economy. All of the following pieces of information relate to the urban revolution except A, a new middle class was developed. B, innovation increased. C, progress was made in higher education. Or D, the noble class gained power. So 3 of these are true and relate to the urban revolution, and 1 is not. So let's look at it. A new middle class was developed. I remember reading that because it talked about with the growth of cities and revitalization of trade, a wealthy middle class of merchants and craftsmen began to emerge. So I know that this one is correct. So I know it's not this one. I'm going to put a little X right there. Innovation increased. Innovation has to do with new ideas and creativity and making inventions and thinking of new ways to do old things. Does it sound like from reading this passage that innovation is happening and increasing? Yes, because they're talking about the fact that they are doing away with the old ways of doing things and they're coming up with new ways of doing it. So innovation did increase. Progress was made in higher education or the noble class gained power. Okay, so when I first looked at higher education, I was thinking, I don't remember them saying anything about higher education. But when I look back, with specialization came sweeping advances as like-minded scholars, merchants, and craftsmen worked together to explore new questions, open new markets, and develop new products and tools. Cities became the intellectual hearts of their regions. With all these great minds together, intellectual experimentation expanded at a rate not seen in Europe since classical Athens. And then they talk about how political shifts brought about new forms of government as cities experimented with ruling themselves. And remember that the noble class is the lords. Those are the ones who are considered the aristocrats. They're the rich people. But now you have this middle class that is gaining more power. As the middle class is gaining more power, the noble, the lords, the aristocrats are losing power. So we can do process elimination here and say that the noble class wasn't gaining power. They were actually losing power. And up top, it talked about scholars and people, intellectuals and like-minded. Now, it may not have been formal higher education like FAMU or Florida State, but it was considered higher education because it was something that you would do after you graduate from a K through 12 school. I don't know if that's what they had in Europe then, but I would use process of elimination and say that no, it's not true that the noble class gained power. All right, number 3. In this context, the word opulent most nearly means squalid, frugal, austere, luxurious. Sometimes in these types of questions, you may not even know all of the meanings of the words that are here, but that's okay. You can still figure out, we actually figured it out while we were reading it, that opulent meant like luxurious. You had to have a certain amount of money to be there. So we would guess that it would be luxurious. Number 4, the author's statement that the church began to sing a new tune and acknowledge that the necessary evils of merchants is A, valid because the author shows how merchants improved the lives of Europeans. B, invalid because the church actually lost power in government during this time. C, invalid because the noble class also benefited from the new economy. Or D, valid because the author acknowledges that capitalism is not always beneficial to everyone. Okay, try process of elimination here. I'm going to see if you can try to figure this one out on your own. The church began to sing a new tune and acknowledge that the necessary evils of merchants and money lenders were perhaps more necessary than evil. And now while I'm up here reading, I'm seeing where it does talk about university towns became centers of science and scholarship. So it does address higher education. Okay, so going back to number 4, first of all, is it valid or invalid, the author's statement? It really wouldn't make a lot of sense for the author to state an invalid statement in their own argument. So we can pretty much eliminate B and C. So is it valid because the author shows how merchants improved the lives of Europeans, or valid because the author acknowledges that capitalism is not always beneficial to everyone? I would say A, because throughout the entire passage, the author is telling us how merchants and people who specialize in certain things, how that improved the European economy and it improved the lives of Europeans, period. And number 5, in this context, the word insatiably most nearly means, okay, so let me go back because I don't remember seeing the word insatiably. So let me make sure that I see it. There we have it down here at the bottom. All right, I'm going to read the whole paragraph. These political shifts brought about new forms of government as cities experimented with ruling themselves. Even the church, which for so long had condemned the behavior of this middle class as detestable, shameful, and insatiably greedy, began to sing a new tune and acknowledge that the necessary evils of merchants and moneylenders were perhaps more necessary than evil. All right, so if you're insatiably greedy, you can see all these words that don't paint a picture of a good person: detestable, shameful, insatiably greedy. And that's the word that even out of context, you could probably take apart and figure out what it means. So that little word root in there, S-A-T-I, think about the word satisfy. And if you were to take off the I-N part, and then you also think about the word satiate, which means to satisfy. If you're insatiable, what does that mean? Okay, appeasable, materialistic, bottomless, or satisfied. Okay, so appeasable, that means like you're able to be appeased, you're able to be calmed down. Does that sound like the word insatiably means? Nah, I don't think so. Materialistic. We might be talking about a person who's materialistic, so let's come back to that one. Bottomless. All right, think about bottomless mimosas. You can't get enough of them, it's never ending. And if we use that in the context of someone who is greedy, we know that someone who is greedy, they can't be satisfied, right? Bottomless, they can't get enough. So it's kind of between B and C right now. And then D, that's actually the opposite, satisfied. Someone who's satisfied, they're happy, they are content with what you give them. So when we look at B and C, C is a better choice because they can't get enough. A person who is insatiably greedy means that they will never be satisfied. There is no bottom, they won't get enough. Okay, so if you got through that practice, good for you. I don't know if you could tell, but that was my first time going through it, but I wanted to show you all my thought process as I was going through it as well, because just because I have a PhD doesn't mean I'm going to pick up something and automatically just comprehend it. I have to use the same strategies that you all will use as you're reading. Several times I have to pick up a document, a book, an academic journal, an article, and read it 3 or 4 times because I didn't comprehend it. Now, the tricky part is you all are going to be timed, so you do have to just keep practicing, which is what I want to talk about now. Studying. How in the world do I prepare or study for this test? So plan a course of study. Now is the time to think about it. You don't want to wait until it's the night before you take the test. You should be thinking about this right now. The best way to start planning your course of study is to read, read, read. I can't stress it enough. Read different kinds of texts. Read news articles, read informational articles, read fictional books, read different kinds of text, because the more you read, the more you're exposed to different types of vocabulary, the more you're exposed to different types of text structures. So that way it gets easier and easier when you have to read a short passage and answer comprehension questions about it. There are also several practice tests that you can do. And if I were you, I would take one mini practice test today. There are several that are free online. Don't pay for anything. Several that are free. Just make sure that when you look up the text, they're at least at the 10th grade level. And most of them will tell you they're either adult or at a particular grade level. And if you feel more comfortable, you can start at the 10th grade level. Now, mind you, students have to be able to read at least the 10th grade level to pass particular standardized tests in order to graduate. So it's not like I'm saying go read some kid books, but I'm just saying make sure that they're at least at the 10th grade level, and then you can work your way up the more you feel comfortable. One thing that I did when I was studying for the GRE was I signed up for Merriam-Webster's Word of the Day. So the Word of the Day just came to my email every day. So that way I learned a new word every day. And even if it was a word that I thought I knew, a lot of times the synonyms weren't necessarily words that I knew. So if I went in and I learned this word and I looked at the synonyms, then it would help me increase my vocabulary. And again, you can improve vocabulary by reading more. Starve your distractions. This is also important. I have deactivated my social media, probably deactivated and reactivated probably 12 times in the last 3 months, because I find myself, even when I'm supposed to be studying, when I'm supposed to be reading, when I'm supposed to be doing anything else, I'll just go on Instagram, go on Facebook, go on Snapchat, just see what the world is doing. But that time that I'm doing that, I could be doing something constructive. So sometimes I have to discipline myself and just say, hey, you know what? Because you're not able to stop pushing that button and just going and seeing what people are doing, we're just going to take that distraction away from you. So sometimes you have to treat yourself like a child. Starve your distraction. And then at the end of the week, on the weekend, go back to social media. If you feel like you're missing out, then you can go back. But starve your distractions. Okay, now I want you to think about, as we're closing out, what are your go-to study methods? You didn't make it this far without being able to pass certain tests or to get certain grades. So what are some things that have worked for you? So I want you to think about that and bring that to our next session, workshop 2, which is on November 12th. And then we'll just start the video by talking about different methods, your go-to study methods. And if I don't get a chance to see you live, I will get with Dr. Shakir so I can get some responses from you all. Thank you for listening and hope to meet you all soon.